folks. Welcome to week 3 of DMD 200, Exploring Digital Storytelling. All right, what are we doing this week? Let's take a look at the modules. So we go down here to modules, take a look at week 3. Okay, so far, the first couple of weeks, we've sort of gotten to know the class, right? If you look at the week 1 overview, we got to know the class, we went over the syllabus, and we talked about some basic story structure elements that are going to be important to all of our projects, right? We talked about 3 acts, character arcs, story genres, subgenres, and themes, and we had some videos to watch about sort of the art and magic of storytelling. Okay, and then last week, in week 2, we took a look at the tools that we're going to be using to make our stories. We're going to use Medium to publish our stories. We're going to use YouTube to publish our videos, which will then go on Medium. We're going to use SoundCloud to hang on to our audio stories, which again will then go on to Medium. And then, of course, we have a variety of project tools such as iMovie, GarageBand, and dozens of others that we can use to make our projects. So that was the last couple of weeks. So now you sort of have 2 of the 3 major components before we can start actually building our projects. Now, there's a lot to learn about making digital storytelling, so this is why we're spending the first few weeks getting to know the basics. So here we are in week 3. What are we doing this week? So a couple things. We are going to go over some things involving brainstorming. Now, you've heard about brainstorming. You've used brainstorming. You've even done some in my previous classes if you've taken classes with me. So we're going to have an ideation handout, which you may have seen before, which will give you some inspiration for brainstorming. We're also going to talk specifically about brainstorming for character development, which is germane to this class. We're going to take a look at the production steps and how we are going to build our projects, the workflow we're going to use to make our projects. It says here we're going to introduce the projects, but we actually did that already last week and the week before even. So by now you should be familiar with all of the projects under assignments, right? We went over assignments here. We talked about the yes ands, which I'll get to in a second. We talked about the micro stories and our 4 major projects. So by now you should be familiar with all of those, so there's no reason to go over those again this week. We're a little ahead on that. And you guys have some sort of textbook reading this week, a consumable, this handout here, New Digital Storytelling. So we're going to take a look at all of these in about 2 seconds. Also note that this Wednesday we're going to do our very first yes and we're going to do it in person. So make sure that you have consumed the podcast that went along with the first yes and. You can find that, of course, here in assignments under yes and number 1. And you can see here there's a podcast you can download and listen to. And there's a little bit of reading to do also about it. So make sure you've got that done and ready to rock and roll for Wednesday. All right, so back to Module 3. Let's see, what are we looking at for our handouts here? So we're going to go over here to Acrobat. Okay, so even though we have 4 different types of major projects, right? We already went over this. We have a visual story, an audio story, a photo story, and a video story, which cover these types of story types, right? Visual, oral, photographic, and moving image. And we talked about the due dates, how you can turn any of these in on week 6, 9, 12, or 15 in any order that you want. So you get to choose the order. So that you know about already. What you don't necessarily know is the workflow that we're going to use to make these projects. So let's go through those quickly, and then obviously you can read through the handout on your own. Make sure by the end of this week you are super familiar with this workflow and how you're going to do this, because start next week we start making the project, so you got to be ready for it. Okay, so as it says here, projects 1, 2, 3, and 4 can be completed in any order you wish, like I just said, on the due dates that are listed above. This gives you a total of 3 weeks to complete each project. Now, in that 3 weeks, there are some steps you have to go through. You can't just rush right to the finished project. You've got to do some steps to get to the finished project. All of my classes have some kind of workflow because that's how it works in the real world. Nothing just goes from idea to finish. There's a whole bunch of steps in between. The final projects, even the drafts of projects, we always have due dates on Fridays, but you can see the specific due dates on Canvas. Okay, so here's the workflow. You are expected to adhere to the following production steps, obviously called a workflow. Step 1, you've got to go through an idea or concept phase, right? You can make a premise, you can posit an idea. All creative work starts with the initial concept and the idea, and we demonstrated this when we all did our 1-minute stories in front of each other, right? That's just a basic idea. It's a 1-minute concept, and then that can then turn into a larger project. So everything starts with an idea. So whether you're using a prompt that I give you, you're drawing some inspiration from real life, or you're using any number of ideation or brainstorming techniques, which we'll look at in a second, ideas, of course, are the seeds to every good story concept or premise. However you develop this initial idea, you are required to document all of your efforts in a creative journal. Now, this doesn't have to be super fancy. You can use the Notes app on your phone. You can keep a notebook. You can just type it up in a running Word document. I don't care. But you have to have some kind of creative journal that you're just going to keep running for this entire class, which will keep track of sort of your brainstorming efforts, the way you come up with your ideas. So this can be done any way you want, and I will be checking on it periodically through the semester. At the end of the semester, you're going to be turning it in. So if it's a digital file, you'll simply turn that in digitally. And if it's an actual notebook, you'll just be photographing pages and sending them to me. Either way, you're expected to keep this creative journal. I will check on it periodically to make sure you're doing it. This is a good habit to get into no matter what sort of creative endeavor you're in. If you're a digital media design student, a communication student, a sports media student, being able to document your ideas and your brainstorming efforts is an important thing to do, because oftentimes the ideas we come up with now may not work for a current project, but will be super useful down the road for other projects. And so it's really good to keep this sort of a thing so you can see where your ideas came from, how you got to the final product, and things you can use later on. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is research. This we call sort of the soak phase, right? So using the internet and the library, as well as just getting out into the world and talking to people, taking photographs, whatever you have to do, of course, make sure that you do your research in a way that is documentable, that is from a real source, right? Make sure you're using good resources, not things that are questionable. Research as much as you can about your idea or concept from as many different angles as you can think of. So if your story is about a panda bear that's going down a river in a canoe, well, you've got three things right there you have to research, right? Panda bears, rivers, and canoes. Get to know as much of that as you can, and that'll sort of help flesh out the details of your story. So that's the type of research we're talking about. We're not really doing historical research here like you would for a paper for English or history class, but you still have to do research about the ideas and concepts that are in your initial idea. The more you get to know about something, the better your story will be. So this is an immersion process, which is why we call it soaking. So don't limit your search to just one location. Don't just hop on Google and do it that way. Look at some books. Take some photographs of your own. Talk to some people. Whatever you have to do to gather the information. Collect all sorts of stuff. And yes, you're going to document your research back in that same creative journal we just talked about. Right? Where did you get your research from? Now, I don't need to see all of your research in the creative journal. That would be way too much writing. But just sort of document where you went and how you got your research. That's all. Okay, step 3, you're going to adjust your idea and concept. Because sometimes you come up with an initial idea and then you go ahead and do a bunch of research and you go, you know what? I think I'm going to change that initial idea. I think I'm going to make some alterations to it because the research I just did gave me some more ideas or gave me some possibilities about how I can change it a little bit. So you're going to adjust your concept as needed based on your research. It could be a minor change in the original idea, or it could be a major change. Either way, you will have discovered new things while doing your research, and that will probably change your initial idea at least a little bit. Again, document any of these adjustments in your creative journal. Okay, next, number 4, you're going to create a draft. We always do drafts, right? You never go right to finish, because in the real world, you have to show your drafts to your boss, to your client, to somebody else who is going to give you feedback. They're going to give you notes on it and say, well, this is working really well, and these things are not working so well, and here's how I would like you to change it. So the draft process is very important to not only the continued progress of the project, but the ability to receive a critique, make some edits, and then keep moving on. In all creative fields, regardless of what you end up doing for a living, the draft process is very important. So, of course, now you're ready to start creating your story, but no creative person worth their salt thinks that their first attempt will be their last. This is the sort of thing you hear sometimes from amateurs, right? Oh, my first idea was my best idea. Maybe so, but it still has to go through the iteration process. You have to try various versions and wring out all the bad ideas before you know you have your best idea. And most importantly, you have to present your drafts to other people, whether it be classmates or clients in the real world, team members or teachers. Somebody else has to give you some feedback on it. That's how creative work works. We don't work in a bubble. We don't work alone. So in the real world, of course, creative types of all sorts are expected to create multiple drafts or iterations. The quantity of which depending heavily on deadlines. In this class, you're expected to submit one draft per project. That's it, one draft. That's not a lot of drafts. In other types of classes, I ask people to turn in 5, 10 different types of drafts. If we're talking about thumbnail sketches for, say, branding and logo design, I have people turn in 30, 40 different drafts. So you're only doing one because these are pretty big projects, so I just want you to give us one draft that you will get some feedback on, okay? So that's step 4. Step 5 is, of course, the feedback, which we sort of already covered. Once you submit a draft to myself and your classmates, you're going to get some feedback from people. And we're going to set this up through Canvas, and people will be able to give you their educated opinion on what you have put forth, and therefore you can take what they've given you, make necessary adjustments, and go from there. Okay, and then last on the actual construction part of things is the final deliverable. So based on the feedback that you received during the draft critique, you go back to the drawing board, metaphorically of course, and make the needed adjustments to your project and complete any unfinished business so as to make your story as amazing as you can possibly make it. Make sure you review the project specs in the project handout to make sure you've covered all your bases for all of those objective goals, like is it the proper length, is it the right size, did you use color properly? Make sure that you're covering all your technical bases as well. And then lastly, after you turn in your final project, which we will be, like I said, uploading to either YouTube or SoundCloud and then linking over to our Medium page, you're going to receive final critique from both me and your classmates, because it's always good to get a little more feedback just so you can see how your final project worked out. All right, so those are the 7 steps we're going to use for every single one of our major projects, not the yes ands and not the micro stories. Those do something completely different, but the 4 major projects, these up here, okay? So again, read through this handout on your own, make sure you're clear with it. I am going to be checking the process for everybody to make sure that you're doing this and get your creative journal ready to rock and roll, however you want to do that, digitally, on paper, whatever. Now, of course, the first required part of the workflow here is the idea and conceptualization phase, which is often referred to as either brainstorming or ideation. In our Week 3 module is this handout you can download. Now, you've probably seen this before if you've taken me for other classes. This is my general ideation handout, sort of ideas for coming up with ideas, as it were. So you can read through this on your own. I'm not going to go through it here, but it's just a bunch of different techniques for brainstorming. One-a-days, mind maps, dump and clump, soak, wash, rinse, and spin, which our workflow is a variation on, thumbnail iterations, or abstractions. Now, your brainstorming technique doesn't even have to be this formal. It can literally be lay on the ground and listen to music and try to come up with some good ideas. Go for a walk, ride your bike, pet a dog, whatever you have to do to get your brain flowing. Eventually, you will figure out as a creative person, as a content creator, as a communication person, how you come up with your best ideas and where and under what circumstances. It's good to start really thinking about that process because you're going to need to employ it over and over and over again. Okay, so that's this handout, which hopefully you find helpful. There's a bunch of good stuff in here. About brainstorming, I'm not telling you which technique to use or that you even have to use any of these techniques, but you do have to have a brainstorming process for yourself. Again, something that happens in the real world all the time. All sorts of studios and offices use ideation techniques and brainstorming, both as individuals and in team settings, so this is something to start really working with. Okay, now a more specific type of brainstorming is this handout here that I'm giving you. Since we're building stories, and we did talk about the idea of protagonist and antagonist, right? You have to have characters in your stories. And your characters can be all sorts of things. They can be people, they can be animals, they can be made-up characters, they could be a rock and a shovel for all I care. It could be an inanimate object. But either way, your characters have to have some kind of development. So this handout is a really short one-sheet handout that goes over some, there's a YouTube video and there's an article about how to build a fictional world, character design and unspoken narrative, which is this one here. Also an article and a YouTube video by these two great storytellers, Kate Mesner and Jesse Smolover. So check out their work. That'll hopefully be a little inspiring. And then there's this sort of basic handout that you can do for yourself, right? Notice the stick figure. Real simple. The characters that appear in your story, you should know a little bit about them and their backstory before you start making a story about them. Even if you're the main character in the story, it helps to identify these traits, right? What is their how do they think? How do they talk? What do they like? What do they see? How do they see the world? Right? What do they care most about? And so you can go through all of these areas and sort of fill in the blanks yourself. You don't have to use this worksheet necessarily, but I find it super helpful. At minimum, you should get to know your characters. Authors of novels, whether it be fiction or even nonfiction, to a certain degree, before they sit down and write the novel, they often write a very long backstory about all of the characters in the story that nobody really sees other than the author, because it helps to inform the story itself, and it allows you to write the characters more fluidly and realistically if you know a lot about them in advance. And this sort of a sheet helps with that. Okay, and then the last thing this week is you've just got some textbook type reading. There's this handout. It's an article called The New Digital Storytelling, Creating Narratives with New Media. This is by Brian Alexander. It's a really good article that just sort of talks about the idea of storytelling. I shouldn't say it's an article. It's actually a chapter out of a book. It talks about digital storytelling in today's world and why that's important. So be sure to read through this. Now, specifically speaking, you only have to read chapter 1 in this, right? So what I did is I gave you a handout with a bunch of chapters from the book. So don't read the whole thing. It's 30 pages. We will get to the other chapters later on. So for this week, you're just reading chapter 1, okay? All right, so that is it for this week's material, right, that you have to get done on your own and start working through that stuff. Remember, you can chat with me on Monday if we want to go over some more stuff. And then be ready for the Yes And on Wednesday. Make sure that you've consumed that podcast and you know it really well, okay? All right, excellent. You guys have a good beginning of the week, and I will see you soon.